Good morning. Welcome to the June edition of this webinar, which is being introduced by Andrew Parkin of the Elmhurst. But for those of you who have not attended one of our webinars before, just give you a background to the Property Care Association. We are the leading representative of the organisation for the UK's protection industry, and our skilled and audited membership across the domestic, commercial and civil sectors, introducing structural repair, structural waterproofing, preservation, damp, flood remediation and invasive wave conditions. So we look after all the members who are associated with those individuals. But this is really to do with energy, and that's related to our damp-proof sector and what have you. So what we'd like to do is introduce Andrew Parkin. He's the Technical Development Director of Elmhurst Energy, and he's going to introduce the webinar with regard to energy performance of buildings, and he's given an industry update on that. So Andrew, it's all over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. It's great that there's, I think there's 60 people in the room as well, which is a really great turnout. So thank you all for coming on this rather uninspiring Thursday morning from what I've just driven through. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. We might get a sort of a weird mirror effect initially while I set up my my presentation. So just bear with me. And let's get that on the screen. Go, and then hopefully everyone can see my presentation. I can't see you now, so I'll rely on Andrew to shout if anything seems to be going awry. Okay, this is quite a whistle-stop tour of everything that's happening in the energy performance of buildings industry. There is a lot of change, and it's happening really quickly as well. For a long time, Elmhurst have been asking for much of what's been we'll discuss today, and I'm really pleased to see it coming through. I am slightly concerned about the pace though, and how this will all come together, but if it does, brilliant. If it doesn't, I'm there are things that I think that need to happen in terms of sort of slowing down the pace a little bit, but we'll come on to that later on. Just a bit about Elmhurst for those who don't know who we are. We're the largest accreditation body in the UK for energy assessors. We have three core functions, which is training, accreditation and software. So the vast majority of our members will have trained in some way, shape or form. Obviously, we accredit all of them in various aspects, from energy assessment for domestic properties all the way through to commercial properties, and things like heat loss calculations, measured energy performance, which is something really exciting and cool that's coming along, which I think will benefit a lot of buildings, particularly historical buildings. There's loads on our website if anybody's interested. And of course, we develop our own software. When we started in 2007, I didn't think we were doing EPCs. We would end up doing the software that we do today. We are a bit more like a software house these days. So plenty of things going on in our software team. So we're going to talk about four key things really, and we'll kick off with EPC reform because this underpins much of what we'll cover later on. And it will be whistle stop, I am afraid, but there's a lot going on. EPCs have been around since 2007, and in fact, the methodologies that underpin them have been around for a lot longer than that. 1993, I think the beginnings of the standard assessment procedure, or SAP, as you perhaps all know it as, sort of being created then, and through various developments has changed over time. But the EPC started in 2007, and it was there as part of an EU directive that we adopted into regulation, and it was for providing information to home buyers and renters about how property performs in terms of its energy, or what could be done to make it better, just help support buying and rental decisions, and then perhaps onward decisions on how to improve buildings. They are used for a great deal more than that today, and I'll get onto that in a second. But the government has chosen to use them as sort of a key report as part of a lot of their policies. Things like minimum energy efficiency standards, things like eco and other types of funding mechanisms. Green Deal, it was part of as well for a while back in the day. So it really has been a sort of a key driver for a lot of things. something like 26 million EPCs now exist on the two registers, the England, Wales and Northern Ireland one, and then the Scotland register, which is a separate register. But, really, really big data sets, really, really useful data sets, but there are issues. And the issues sort of range between, do they do what they need to do in the current climate? Are we able to rely on them for things like net zero or climate change? Is it them being effectively cost metric driven? Are they helpful in terms of helping deal with things like fuel poverty? So we've had to sort of look back at ourselves and work out whether we need to do something else with the EPC. Does it need to say certain things? Underneath all of that is the assessment procedure trustworthy? It is designed, and I'm predominantly talking about domestic EPCs here, so existing domestic specifically. There's a methodology called RdSAP, and the idea behind it is reduced data. It should be able to be used on site as a visual inspection, but anything that requires you just to use your eyes or gathering of evidence has sort of inherent restrictions or limitations, and that sort of is a result of using assumptions, and those assumptions are probably not accurate for most properties. If you look at a large property portfolio, actually it's spooky. RdSAP and SAP are really, really good. The science behind it is really good. The average property is the average property. The average U value for a wall is absolutely right. The problem is you have a lot of properties at either end of the spectrum, and then stuff in between. And we need to start moving away from some of that wherever possible. So we need to have a look at that. Also, the repeatability of it. If we make the assessment more complicated, the repeatability goes down, and that's not so good as well. So there is this sort of sweet spot in how do we get the assessment right. Ultimately, we need to make sure that we have a trustworthy process if we are going to change it. And then also compliance and enforcement. And I will be the first to say this, and I've said this for a long time, there is very little enforcement of Energy Performance of Buildings Directive regulations, and then MEES regulations as well. Very, very little going on there. It is quite surprising how much compliance there is considering that, but there are large swathes of non-compliance and non-enforcement that need to be addressed. I won't spend any time on this slide, but that's just a snapshot of what EPCs are currently being used for or are going to be used for in the future. Sort of some of the warm homes grant stuff that the government's putting together as well will utilise EPCs. So they need to do many things for many people, and they need to wear many hats. And it is quite difficult when the document was written for one or two purposes. However, it is just an output. It is just a document, and it can be whatever we want it to be. A couple of things that we've spoken about already, in a lot of different forums, is does the EPC metric, which is the A to G rating you see at the top of the EPC, does that do all things to all people? And clearly it doesn't. On a domestic EPC, it is a cost metric. So the calculation is quite complicated, but it goes through several stages and it gets to a point where it goes, okay, this is the inherent efficiency of your building. Now, how much is the fuel going to cost? And that will factor the rating. And that's great if you're looking at fuel poverty or anything to do with cost. But if you're trying to look at carbon or you're trying to reduce energy, or it's a bit blunt, and it doesn't do some of the carbon stuff. The EPC does have carbon in there, but it's buried down at the bottom of it. It used to have sort of equal prominence at one point, but for various reasons, various governments have devalued it, and now there's a review of whether that needs to change as well. But I don't think the ratings are particularly helpful, user friendly. They don't drive people to make really good decisions on their property, I believe. The recommendations are not as helpful as well. The difference between a current and a potential, that's not a great story either, because actually to get your potential rating, you've got to do all recommendations on the EPC, and you've got to do them in the order on the EPC that's suggested as well. So there's definitely something there that needs to be reviewed. But we can't lose this metric, because if we do, we lose 18 years of progress, 18 years of historical information, and we can't compare against anything. So we've got to keep it, but we've got to augment it and complement it. So what is the government looking at? Well, they want to. There was a consultation that concluded on the 26th of, I think, February. I might get that wrong. It is in the slide. And they are now reviewing all those consultation feedback points. But one of the key areas was, what should we do about metrics? And it did propose some different metrics. Energy being one of them. Carbon, because it already exists. Energy use, as it actually does exist as well on the EPC. It's sort of not hidden, but it's not sort of high up on the in terms of where it's displayed on the EPC. But things like fabric, we need to start being a little bit more clear about how does fabric perform, and what does a comfortable home look like. We want to look at the heating systems, because we are at the cusp and we are starting to see a lot of movement towards clean, low carbon heating systems like heat pumps. But that doesn't just mean heat pumps, by the way. But yeah, we need to start thinking about, how do we decarbonize? It is a difficult process. With a lot of properties, there needs to be extra work done to that property to allow that decarbonized heating system to be installed. And we need to go on a bit of a journey with it over the next decade and a half, because most people will be upgrading their heating systems in that time period, and they need some good information. And also, smart readiness is another metric that the government have started to bring in and think about. And I must admit, to some days, I am not clear on this, what this one does. And to some extent, with all these metrics, we don't know how they're put together yet, because we haven't seen the end of the consultation, and then we haven't seen anything that comes off the back of that in terms of clarification. But for me, smart readiness is something that all buildings really need to go through, which is to allow it to start using some of the electricity tariffs that are now available and will be available in the future. You need a smart meters to access them. You need smart technology in there to utilize them, that can switch on and off depending on whether those tariffs get you cheaper, in some case no cost electricity. It's about, how do we start to balance the grid, and how do properties take advantage of those kinds of things. So they're the metrics that we're looking at. And the idea is, and this isn't what an EPC is going to look like, but there is a little bit of something in here, I think. I think sort of food labeling, you red, amber, green, sort of highlighting what's good, what's not so good, and what's really not good for you. That might be what a future EPC starts to look like. The Scottish government have been a little bit more forthcoming with what they think then their EPC of the future is going to look like. I haven't chucked it on here because of time, but if anybody's interested, if you look at the Scottish government consultations on EPCs, they've mocked up a few examples, but it is all subject to change. And as I say, we're going through a consultation at the moment. But the idea is that you get this sort of more balanced view of what a property does, from its cost, its energy, its fabric, its heating system, and smart readiness as well, which may or may not be a metric in a traditional sense of the A to G scale. And the idea is that there is an upgrade path that isn't necessarily all about putting more insulation in the property, isn't necessarily about upgrading the heating system in the traditional way. It's, what does a decarbonised route look like? What is possible on a property where there are restrictions? So, and it is all about looking at how we can start to make improvements to buildings that may already be having issues around damp, mold, poor ventilation, and taking them away from those situations, but also ensuring that any property that is being upgraded doesn't end up in a situation where we end up introducing the risk of damp and mold condensation. One of the sort of missing pieces of EPCs at the moment is that sort of health aspect, and I know the government are starting to look at this quite seriously as well, probably away from EPC reform, but may form part of what happens to EPCs in the future. We don't look at ventilation particularly well on EPCs. In fact, if you start adding any sort of mechanical ventilation in, there is a negative impact on the rating, which may or may not be right, but it doesn't exactly encourage people to do the right thing. And equally, we found that when you're looking at any of the recommendations, if you start to seal up the property, there is no recommendation for ventilation. So there's something that needs to happen there. And this is so important as we move to decarbonise heat, because again, we are going to be sealing up the buildings that much more. We're going to be insulating them to stop unnecessary heat escaping. And therefore we need to start thinking about the ventilation. And clearly we need to think more carefully about historical buildings or traditional buildings, because there are things that are suitable and things that aren't suitable for them. Equally, if they're in sort of protected areas or they have protections against them, so they might be grade 2 listed, for example, we need to think more carefully about what those recommendations say and how those packages of recommendations are put together. Currently, you might get double glazing, solar panels, external insulation recommended, and well, they might be possible, but in the vast majority of situations they are not, and therefore there doesn't seem to be a pathway to upgrade, particularly around a decarbonised future either. So we need to look at alternatives. We need to smart technologies as well. So that's all going to come into the new EPC. We're also looking at validity periods. 10 years is too long. I think everybody accepts that, but what is right? So that was asked. Also, the ability to access the data around the EPC. We think that's brilliant because, number one, it means somebody else is looking at the EPC and the data, and that's great because it means that there's some quality assurance checking going on, and we can stop some of the poor things that are happening in the industry. Equally, data should be available to the homeowner and anybody they want it to be available to, so that they can do good things with it. Already mentioned EPC assessment quality, but it is paramount that we improve in those areas as well. And let's not forget about display energy certificates or air conditioning inspection reports, which are the other types of assessments that go on, which are so important in terms of understanding how we're using buildings, how we're using air conditioning systems, and how we can improve both of those things from an occupancy point of view and from a facilities management point of view. So what's happening? Well, the consultation closed on the 26th of February. They've had 1,500 responses or thereabouts. That's a lot to plough through, but we are expecting something from them by the end of the summer. That may slip. I hope it doesn't. If it does, it means something for the onward timeline. But I do know the team over at MHCLG are working really hard on this. We are expecting new EPCs to come at some point in the latter half or the second half of 2026. It's got to be in time for the future home standards and the home energy model that's coming in, and the minimum energy efficiency standards. And that's the three other areas I'm going to very briefly touch upon. Okay, so we've mentioned that the methodologies are going to change as part of the EPC reform. We've actually got another step to come in the next couple of weeks before anything else starts to happen around EPC reform, and this is RdSAP 10. This has been in planning for probably about 3 years. It's taken a year to actually put together and get it into software, but it is coming, and it's coming in the next couple of weeks. 15th of June is the key date. It is a totally new number, so we've had RdSAP 9 point something for a very long time, for the last 10-15 years. RdSAP 10 is the first big change we've had in a long time. It is more accurate. They will take longer to produce, but they will incorporate new technologies. And as I say, 15th of June is the key date. I'll cover what's in there very briefly. And then actually, very recently, this is nearly hot off the presses, SAP 10.2, which is the current version of full SAP, is having a midlife update this year as well. And it's being done to allow a bit of flexibility in the transition away from SAP and into something called the home energy model. And this will effectively take over from SAP at some point. We'll pass the baton on and home energy model will take over. And eventually we'll have not just a new build version of that, but also an existing building version as well. We're trying not to call it RDHEM, but that's basically what it will be. And that's to support net zero ready homes from 2025 onwards, probably from 2026, depending on how the building regulations consultation concludes. So a lot of consultations going on. I hope you understand that. Lots of things changing. The key things that are changing in RdSAP 10 are all on the screen. I'm not going to read them word for word, but key things are we can now start to take into consideration ventilation parameters in more detail. We can actually take the air pressure test results if they've been produced or they can be produced for a property. That's really interesting because that will instantly improve the accuracy of RdSAP EPCs. We've got more stuff on PV, so solar panels, including batteries for the first time. I think we can have up to 3 batteries in a property, and also solar PV diverters. So you're putting hot water into, electricity into hot water cylinders. We've got more, a better way of recording insulation. So we've had certain thicknesses available to us since the day dot. We're now going to get more interim steps so we can be that much more accurate. And if one of the banes of, I think, most people involved with RdSAP is if you can't get in a loft, you have to put no access. It will assume the insulation that was present when the property was constructed, which is never right. So any of the older properties up to sort of the 1980s, we're instantly going to start assuming 100 millimeters of loft insulation in there. It is a better assumption than assuming nothing. So that's a big step in the right direction, because most lofts, I think the vast majority of lofts will have had some intervention at some point in their history. 100 millimeters is about right. So look out for that. That is an instant improvement on EPC ratings. But obviously, ideally, everyone gets into a loft and assesses it. We've got the ability to put some extra insulation into walls, more definition of insulation there. We're also going to be measuring windows, which means by virtue we will also know the wall areas of a property, which means more accurate recommendations. Because we're measuring windows, the time on site is a lot longer. We've got a lot more options around windows as well, so they'll be more accurately modelled. And we're all looking at ways of how we can make that as slick as possible, because it is quite a lot of extra data that needs to be calculated or collected. Window shutters, that's going to be more important for summer overheating, but also keeping heat in. They're being included in the methodology. More ventilation, more floor insulation stuff. And there's probably more to it than that as well. But as I say, it's quite a jump in methodology, quite a jump in detail and accuracy. Going to need more time on site. We're predicting probably an extra 10, maybe even 20 minutes per assessment. And I think as people get used to the methodology, as software improves to meet the needs of our members, that time will naturally start to come down a little bit. But definitely more data, more time on site. A couple of key things. RdSAP 10 will share the same fuel data prices as the current RdSAP. So we won't see many ratings moving around. A lot of people have said, well, why are you keeping very old fuel prices? The reality is, as long as those fuel prices have moved up in relation to each other, it doesn't matter what price we use, as long as they are in line with each other. And because we didn't want to see a lot of variables changing all at once, we didn't want to see properties that were achieving the minimum energy efficiency standard of E now, and then through no fault of their own and no further changes to the property, drop down into an F because the methodology's changed. They want to sort of minimize that. So we've kept with the fuel prices. However, there is another set of fuel prices that I use for calculating cost savings and recommendations and things like that. They are updated every 6 months in the back end of the software. So they've got really, really accurate fuel prices. But yeah, we're not expecting things to move around significantly, maybe 1 or 2 SAT points, depending on the property. We've done a lot of modelling on this and we haven't seen much more than that. But it will give us better recommendations and better savings figures. All this accuracy will definitely do that. So here's some positive impacts that we've sort of identified, because people tend to want to know what makes a big difference. If you've got a property with much newer glazing or lots of small glazing, where they've removed windows or they've designed to have smaller windows, or indeed if they're facing, the majority of the glazing is facing south and by virtue very little facing north, we're going to see some improvements there. Not significant, but 1 to 2 points on both of those things. Any property where the access to the loft wasn't possible in the previous EPC, we think that's many top floor flats, to be fair, but there are lots of houses as well where access wasn't possible or access didn't happen. That will make a big difference. So we're recommending to people that they're at least aware of that when they're looking at the next thing that they do to the property on the next EPC they have, or if they're getting involved in minimum energy efficiency standards because they're a landlord. Any property with lots of LED lighting, particularly ceiling spots, we're now counting every bulb rather than every fitting, and LED lighting being that much more efficient and cost efficient, they will have an impact. And if you get an air test, RdSAP assumes a air permeability of 15. Anything that's sort of around the low end of the spectrum, sort of 4 or 5, will increase the rating by 2 or 3 points. And any property with a battery, there aren't many of them, but when you do have a battery, you're gonna get an increase. But we need to double check that because it depends on how many batteries, how big the batteries are. So don't take that as an absolute gospel. And any property where mechanical ventilation was already present, they're now being introduced into a database, and the database is far more accurate. We're not choosing generic descriptions here. We're using accurate information. That will have a big impact in a positive way. Okay, how are we doing for time? Good. Future Home Standard then is the new building regulations that's coming out this year. I expected to hear about it by now. It was consulted on last year, along with the future building standards, and we're still waiting to hear which direction the government, and we have had a new government, so okay, can understand why we've got a bit of a delay, but we need to know which direction. There's 2 options. Are we going to go with the future home standard? One is a little bit more onerous than the other, and it will set what we call the notional building, which is what we're comparing a brand new building that's being built against. Is it better, or is it performing worse than the notional building? So we need that. And then the home energy model is the new methodology that will come out in order to make the most of the new building regulations. So for those that love their parts of building regulations, this is part L. This will be 2025. We've had lots of consultations on this. It's taken a long time to do. It's been the biggest gap between building regulations that I've certainly known. That's probably true, period. We did have an interim step, though. It's fair to say there was the first part L change in 2021, which introduced more stringent requirements from an energy point of view, but it was sort of like a halfway step to what they wanted to produce, which was the future home standard. The idea is that banning, I don't like the word banning, but it almost becomes impossible to put any fossil fuels into a property in order to achieve the building regulations. Call it a ban if you want. And so it's a move towards low carbon heating. In most cases, because you're designing the property from scratch, you can design in all the parameters that make things like heat pumps work. It will mean a heat pump. And as I said, the future home standards will use the home energy model for compliance calculations, but I've starred that for caveat reasons because SAP 10.3 is getting this, we're getting a new revision of SAP just to build a bit of time in should all of this change come too quickly. We haven't quite got HEM quite where it needs to be. It just gives us a little bit of breathing space in order to carry on with SAP for a bit longer. We're going to update it for key things. So the notional dwelling will be in there and all the new carbon and energy factors for fuels will be in there as well. So for those who keep an eye on these sorts of things, it's quite interesting. If you've got an electric car, some of the apps tell you how carbon intense the grid production is that particular day. We monitor that over a very long period of time. And then as we see the trends coming through, we then amend the carbon factors and the energy intensity factors for different fuels. It tends to be that carbon changes quite rapidly, particularly for electricity, and it's gone down by sort of 3/4 over the last 10 years. So electricity now is, for want of a better phrase, 3/4 better for the planet than it used to be. And it will reach net zero at some point. The government's targets are within the next 10 years, we will pretty much be using nothing but renewables or green energy production. There'll be a little bit of gas still in there for peak production or peak periods, but generally speaking, the grid will be fully decarbonised. Bit of nuclear in there for obvious reasons, to give it a nice base load. And then the challenge will be for us to balance that grid so there aren't so many peaks and troughs, accepting that in winter there's always going to be peak loads. So that's where we're going with SAP. It's coming in. We're expecting it to be in place by September. We're also expecting HEM to be there or thereabouts at that point. But as I say, this gives us just a bit of flexibility. I said there were two options on the table for new homes in the building regulations. For those that are interested, these are the two options. One is heating via heat pump with PV as a requirement, some enhanced mechanical ventilation and wastewater heat recovery. The inverse is true the other way. There will still be a heat pump, but no PV, no wastewater heat recovery. And there are some differences there. I clearly side with option one because it's the greener, better option on the table. It's better for consumers, people who are buying new homes, it's better for the planet. But option two, it depends on where we go. We have got this challenge set by the government for 1.5 million new homes. We will see where this goes. But either way, one of these two options will be what effectively creates our notional dwelling within the calculation. There is a transition. There are two options on the table as well. I won't get into the detail, but one is shorter than the other. And again, the government will make a decision on how quickly we transition to the new building regulations. But assuming that we take option one, the table at the bottom is how we will phase in. By 2030 onwards, all properties will be built to the new building regulations, in essence. For those who know about this as well, we're still building buildings today that are 2 or 3 building regulations ago, because they were allowed to start a building. Foundations were in, that was the building regulations you were going to use. That started to phase out now, particularly with the latest building regulations that came in 2021, but it still happens. And from a software provider's point of view, it's a real pain because we have to maintain 2 decades old software, which if anybody knows anything about software, that is not in any way ideal. So we're very keen to see these transitions to happen as smoothly and as quickly as possible. So let's talk a little bit about the home energy model. I have 10 minutes. It is the replacement for SAP. It used to be known as SAP 11. It's been rebranded effectively, but it is a more detailed methodology. And in fact, it's more than a methodology. It's a big it's a big engine. And I'll try and explain what that means as we go through, but I probably won't have time to do it justice. The idea is that you collect the data that's appropriate for the use, and HEM has maybe, let's be silly, it's 1,000 data points. It isn't quite 1,000 data points, but it's a lot of data. And the use of that methodology, the particular use, will be called a wrapper. So nothing like M&M or whatever. It's just what part of that HEM model do you wrap around and say, that's what I need. And then we'll take that subset of data and then run it through the HEM engine and say, give me a result. That HEM engine will calculate on a 30-minute interval. SAP does it 12 times a year, once a month, effectively. It knows that the temperature in January is much lower than it is in July. It knows that the winds are different, blah, blah, blah. HEM will be able to do this dynamically almost every 30 minutes. So there's thousands more calculations being done by the engine. So there's a lot more resource around getting those calculations to work. There is a lot more data that can be collected, including shading, pipe work, insulation around pipes, huge amounts of other bits that we can add in. And again, this is what the government are working on at the moment to try and work out exactly what should go into some of the uses of HEM. It's moving forward. There's more to HEM. In terms of the timeline, We did have a government-run competition for 6 packages of work to look after HEM. They've now been assigned, and I think there are 4 organisations involved, and they've started developing the wrappers and the actual methodology parts that are associated with those wrappers. We are also waiting for the Future Home Standard consultation. I put imminent just to cover my own backside because I don't know exactly when, but it should be very, very soon. In order to make all of this work, we need to know. And we also need to understand those transitional arrangements because the timeline depends upon them. And we do know that SAP 10 will come out around September and HEM should be around at the same time. But because it's so new and because there's so much to do, that it might be there, but it might not be widely used because it's still being sort of running. So that's a very whistle-stop tour around the Future Home Standards and HEM. I'll spend 10 minutes on minimum energy efficiency standards, and then hopefully I haven't absolutely addled your mind on a Thursday morning. You'll have a few questions for me. Okay. There's 2 consultations. Both of them effectively, both did have a consultation, domestic and non-domestic, in 2021. Domestic's consultation concluded in 2021, and we did have a response to it this year. But at the same time, we had another consultation to take that response and say, okay, we understood what you meant then, but things have moved on. We want to ask you some more questions around it. And that consultation concluded on the 2nd of May this year. So we are now waiting on DESNES, or the ESNS, as some people have started calling it, to review all those consultation responses. They, I think, have had even more responses compared to the EPC Reform consultation. So there's plenty to work their way through there. But this is effectively to take us to what will be a minimum of Band C by the end of this decade for all domestic rental properties that are in the private rental sector. Inversely, the non-domestic MEES consultation is still outstanding. We have not had a response yet. The government have committed to providing that by the end of the first half of this year. So at the end of this month, we're expecting something. And if we haven't heard anything, then obviously we will be asking why and where is it? Because there's a lot of frustrated landlords, a lot of frustrated energy assessors out there waiting for this information. Because if you take the previous consultation, we needed to get to an EPCB by the end of this decade. And that's jolly difficult in the timeline. But equally, if you're a building owner, you need to know what you need to start thinking about doing. So we are waiting on that. We know that we won't get a new consultation on it. They'll take the findings from that. They've been doing a few sort of runarounds, asking lots of questions around payback periods and exemptions. But effectively, the government will come back and say, we're doing it, we're not doing it. I think both are as likely as each other at this moment in time, but we just don't know. However, I will say this, the government has put out funding for training for non-domestic energy assessors this year. The market at the moment is on a downwards turn because the first round of MEES went through. A lot of work had been done and the market grew exponentially and now slowed back down again to normal levels. Why would you support an industry and provide training for another 500 or so energy assessors if you didn't need them? So I am sort of chastened by that, I think. But watch this space on this one. The domestic MEES consultation is happening. The minister and the undersecretary are really sort of forthright about this. It is super challenging. The previous government backed out of it without responding to the consultation, didn't really want to get involved because they knew it was difficult. The challenge is we have the worst performing properties in Western Europe. We have got to do something to improve them. I'm not saying every property needs to be improved in exactly the same way. We need to do it very carefully. It is complicated, but we need to move things forward. The rest of Europe have got exactly the same challenge to a different extent, and they are all doing something very similar. they're looking at how they can improve the standard of buildings from to a minimum standard and then move that minimum standard on. So we're not unique in this challenge, and we're not unique in this solution. So the consultation that closed in May looked at sort of key things. Spookily enough, they're going to look at how they can make use of the metrics that are going to be in the new EPC, follow EPC reform. So they do kind of fit hand in glove. It is complicated, and I apologise, but we'll go through it. The government want to use a primary metric, and then they want to use a secondary metric against that, and allow a landlord to achieve the primary and one of the two secondaries. So whether that's to achieve I think they're going for a fabric one, so a fabric of C or better. We don't understand what a C on fabric really means yet, but I rather suspect it will be a wall that performs to a certain U value. We'll see. And then the landlord will have the choice of using a smart readiness metric or the heating system metric. Both of those things are to move the property towards an ability to be decarbonised. So I can see what that's all about. Alternatively, they have proposed that we could look at having two metrics and use them both in a balanced way to achieve a certain result, or meet the overarching standard across all three metrics. That sounds jolly complicated. They also looked at the cost cap. The cost cap currently is £3,500. That was set in 2016. And obviously time has moved on, and in order to get to a C, you need to do more to a property. Therefore, there needs to be more cost associated with that, and the cost cap needs to go up. That was set at £10,000 in the previous consultation. That was 4 or 5 years ago. They've basically added 5 on to that and asked if that's good, bad, or otherwise. They did propose that there could be an affordability cost cap, which brings that back down to £10,000, depending on different variables: rent, council tax ban, local authority based approach. I quite like this. It does add complexity, but it does make it a little bit fairer on landlords who have lower rents, particularly those in the north of England or those that offer peppercorn rents for very, very valid reasons, to potentially people who work on the land or in a particular location. Talking to the National Trust, they're in this bracket, and they're very supportive of that, and I can certainly understand the virtues of having that. They're also looking at as a way of saying, well, we're going to increase the cost cap, but maybe we'll increase the period which that cost cap exemption lives for. 10 years is the proposal. It's currently 5 years, so doubling that. I have absolutely no scruples about either of those things. It's down to others to say something on that. The timescales are quite interesting, and this is what a lot of people talk about. We need to hit band C by one of two dates: new tenancies by 2028, and then all tenancies by 2030. This mirrors MEES 1.0, where it was 2018 you had to hit an E for all new tenancies, and then 2020 EPCE for all tenancies. And there's some definitions on the screen, but I won't read them word for word. I'll just leave them there for a minute if you want to scan across them. There are properties that fall outside of the scope of MEES, and I think the government are looking at how they can ensure that all properties that should be in the scope of MEES are in there. Now, there are properties that have been rented out for many, many years, decades in some cases, that have never had an EPC. So that's quite a challenge if they suddenly dropped into this and are expected to hit a C. Equally, there are short-term rents, the short-term lets that have never had EPCs or have circumnavigated the need to have them because they're only rented out for a short period of time. And there are some questions of whether they should be included as well. So the transition is quite complicated. As it's complicated in the sense that we're going to have to move from one standard to another by a certain date, and there are some different dates there. Equally, if you already meet MEES and then the EPC changes and then you don't meet MEES anymore, that's problematic. So being able to demonstrate that you meet MEES now and carrying that over, even though there is a new EPC and there is a new minimum standard is important. I'm also quite concerned that we don't know enough about the metrics and how they will work. We don't know enough about how the home energy model will work, and we don't know enough about how MEES will apply those things. So we need to be quite careful about how we transition all of this. As I said, short-term lamps will be in the scope of MEES. This is my analogy. I did this, by the way. You'll notice it's particularly professional in its the way it's been put together. But at the moment, because we've got three things all changing at once: EPC reform, methodologies changing, and a new MEES coming in, it kind of feels like skateboarding down a hill, but you're not just on one skateboard, you're on three, and they're all moving around from each other. And if anything goes wrong, this is what's going to happen. They're all going to fly off and do different things, and I'm going to fall off the skateboard. We need to be so careful about how we put this together. My concern is that we're going to have to do all this very quickly. There is a need to do it quickly because time is short and we've got to start making some good progress. So we can't take 15 years about this, but we're giving ourselves sort of a year and a half to see most of this through. And there's a lot of dependency here. So that's quite difficult. There's a lot of pressure on companies like Elmhurst, definitely on the government, but certainly on the industry to understand what this all means and how it impacts them and what they need to do the right thing. What we're saying to a lot of energy assessors at the moment and to their clients is, if you've got a C, great. Your EPC is going to last 10 years. Even if they change the validity period, that EPC should last for 10 years. So get your EPCs done and be done for 10 years. And we'll see what happens in that 10-year period. That's the best way of being assured of what's going to happen. Otherwise, we're rolling the dice a little bit. There's a lot of dependencies, as I say, that are going to change, and we're going to have to work our way through this. But one thing's for sure, Elmhurst are going to be very, very communicative about this. This is what we do. We produce bulletins, news items. We're on social media all the time. Our website is sort of really active and up to date. So anybody who wants to know more, do tune in. You can listen to our podcast. Shameless plug time. You can subscribe to it. It'll be delivered to you. And we do cover most of these topics a lot. The news pages, have a look at us on social media, and do sort of follow us on there, because we're always posting stuff. And this is going to move relatively swiftly, and there's going to be some detail in there as well. This is my current timeline. I will make these slides available to you, by the way, if anybody's asked that question. And this is subject to change, but this is kind of where we think we're at the moment. So I'll just leave that on the screen for a minute or two so you can take it all in. But between now and the end of the decade, everything changes, and we're all going to need to change with it. So I think that's me done. I'll just move the slide on now. Thank you for listening. I hope that was very good, and I'll take any question you have.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. We can clearly see that change is going to happen, and the timescales are pretty short, really. So, 2026 is only literally around the corner to try and get the new EPCs into place. So, yeah. So, just one question with regard to that is, there's a lot of new metrics being added to this, and policy changes, as you say, using that last slide with, like standing on 3 skateboards at the same time. The EPC will increase the amount of, the new EPC will increase the amount of time to produce the outcomes. So on top of that will be additional training, there'll be surveyor assessors, all these will drive up costs in producing these EPC. Who will pay these additional costs, and how will the additional training be implemented within this relatively short period of time?
It's a great question. Yeah, and yes, there will be costs, and the job of our industry, of government, is to look at how we can minimise those wherever possible. Technology is moving on rapidly as well. So what we do know is that when we understand what the methodology looks like, we will be giving all that information out to our membership so that they can understand the scope of it. Of course, there will be training for energy assessors. The question will be, is it such a big change that they'll need to do some upskill training like they had to do in 2012, or can we do this through the usual traditional methods of CPD? That will have an impact on the cost, of course, as well. But the government is actually putting their hand in the pocket. The Warm Homes funding that is being worked on at the moment, some of it's been released already, and there will be another announcement this year in the spending review. As long as they don't pull some of it for other means, there will be some money around to look at how we can best make the best stab at this the skills gap that will inevitably be there. The funding that they've already committed to is over 2 years as well. So, that's encouraging. They're not just trying to throw some money at something and say, you've got 6 months. And I'm expecting more of that. The EPC will cost more. Some will argue that's not right, that's not fair. Others will argue absolutely it's right. The EPC has, in my opinion, been undervalued for a long period of time, and therefore there's not been the right fee structure for it, which has produced in some cases, poor results. Now's the time to start putting that right, but within reason. Who's going to pay for it? Well, I mean, for MEES, it's very much in the landlord's interest to use a really good energy assessor that's going to do them a good job. That will save them money by using somebody that's quality. But initially, they will obviously have to pay a little bit more for a really high quality assessment of their property or properties. As the data set increases, then the cost goes up. The skill for us as an industry is to make sure that data set doesn't go off the charts, because underpinning all of this is repeatability. If you make something so complicated, and we look at something like passive house, brilliant standard, wonderful, but I get 3 different passive house assessors to do an assessment, they'll do things differently because it's quite open in terms of its structure and it's a massive data set, and they'll rightly do it because they'll be able to justify why they've done it. And there's actually nothing wrong with that unless you want to compare one report with another. So we've got to be able to keep that in place. So yeah, I think there's a very long answer. I don't have the absolute answer to it, but let's be fair. Like everything, costs are going up, and where justified, they probably should do. But we will try and minimize that. And of course, we'll have all the AI stuff that's coming down the line. You know, how to make assessments easier, less onerous. Have the person doing the person bit and let the computer do the computer bit, basically.
Yeah, because that's an interesting point you raised there, when you've got 2 assessors on there. So Nick Spalding raised that question. It says, how much of the rating in the new format is down to the opinion of the assessors? And just as an example, if 2 assessors inspect the property on the same day, would you expect them to produce EPCs with the same score?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to give you 2 examples. One person turns up and the homeowner's there. Another person turns up and they've picked up the keys from the estate agent. Maybe not a perfect example for this one, but if the homeowner's there, they'll be able to give me some information, or they might be able to pull something out of a drawer and present it to me. If I've just picked up the keys from the agent and the agent aren't particularly engaged, then I won't get that information. And that's why it's so important that people understand the importance of an EPC and what has an impact, and making sure that all that information's around. The biggest bane of any energy assessor's life is getting access to documentary evidence, because we're not blessed with X-ray vision and we can't start cutting and drilling and taking panels off walls. So we would love it if there was a database or some way of documenting all the things that have happened to a property so that we don't have to start guessing. That's the way to increase repeatability, so that you end up with the same result each time. The methodology has been written to allow someone to use a default, because we've got to produce a report. We can't just go, oh, well, if I don't have the information, you're just going to have to transact without it. We've got to be able to produce a report. We can't hold up a transaction. So we have to use a default as a worst case scenario. What I'm hoping for is that we can make a better stab at those defaults over time. And one example I'll point to is we are now utilizing measured energy performance, things like in situ U value testing or heat transfer coefficient tests. And these give us really, really accurate results about actually how that property performs. And we can put that into our methodologies. Not allowed to do it on EPCs yet, but it will come at some point. And that will give us more accuracy. Yes, there's more cost. But the one thing that will come from all of that is the more of that happens, the more that will be fed back into the methodology. And we can start to adjust those assumptions. So for this particular kind of property of this age band and this construction, we'll update the assumed U value for the wall. And then we will be a bit closer to the truth. So I think that's another sort of change that's going to come. Nick also asked about what happens to properties that have a potential rating of C. We're not going to get to a B, by the way, for domestic properties. That's commercial properties, and they have a different scale anyway. So we'll talk about that another day. But if you imagine, yeah, there are 2.3 million or so properties in scope here. Some of them won't be able to get to a C. It just won't be possible. That's what the exemptions are for. We don't want to see lots of properties coming out of the marketplace. Landlords and landlords associations are pointing fingers at me saying this will drive landlords away. I don't know if that's true. I know landlords are leaving the market already for various reasons, and new landlords have an option to come into the marketplace. We are seeing a lot more professional landlords coming in, or buy or build to rent landlords. I'm not saying that's a good thing either, but the market is changing and it will continue to change. I would like to see a government come in and put some incentives on the table for landlords. If I'm being honest, that's the right way of doing it. You need carrots, you need sticks, and you need tambourines to make things work. Otherwise, if it's all carrot, well, okay, we're wasting our money. If it's all stick, it's just unfair. And if nobody knows about it, then no one can do anything about it. So we need all three of those things. Oh, Andrew, we've lost you. You've gone on mute.
Okay, I'm back again. Yeah, sorry. It's you can see you've got a very difficult task ahead of you in a very in a very short period of time. But the interesting point is building data sets would help in accumulating all this data together, which will then simplify it and you have better use of your algorithms and within your software and well, if you build lots of different data sets and what have you. So that's something that we could be looking at.
Yeah, I mean the government are very keen to bring digitized data, digitized processes together. So they are focusing on how they can start to digitize property data from all areas. So looking at the local land charges, for example, will all be digital by the middle of by about 2028. That's useful information. You've got the gas grid network. You've got a number of other sort of key databases. If you can augment data together and use it appropriately, we can stop using assumptions. It's that simple.
Brilliant. Well, we're just about up on time. Thank you for all those attending there. There's lots of changes going to happen, and Andrew's got a very, very difficult task of bringing all these data sets, etc., and new policies, future standard homes, minimum energy standards, all collating all these together to build up this EPC, which will be, as I say, 2026, latter part 2026. Hopefully,
yeah, it should all be together by the end of next year, and we'll start to see things happening against all of that in 2027 onwards. And as you say, MEES, the first date really is 2028 for domestic properties. It will be interesting if the government sticks to those timelines, but I think to a certain extent they're committed. So it's going to be a bit of a ride. But as I say, the support will be there, and I'll come back to this group again as we move forward, because invariably things will start to change and important things will need to be said. So I'm happy to keep supporting this forum.
Thank you once again, Andrew, for that. This presentation has been recorded, and it will be made available in the very near future on the PCA website. But once again, thank everybody for attending this June webinar, and we appreciate it very much indeed. So thank you to all.
Thanks all.
Have a good day. Have a good day.
Have a great summer. Cheers.
Thank you.